When we work with children, we come across other types of learning differences. Since these other differences can co-occur with dyslexia, we need to be mindful of what they are. This is a brief overview of these other types. In summary, dyslexia affects a person's ability to learn to read and write and spell easily. It's a language processing issue. It has impacts on their short-term memory, their auditory processing, their organising and sequencing of information ability, and their ability to hear the sounds that make up words, which is called phonological awareness. It affects at least 10% of the population. Dyscalculia is when there is a specific maths issue. Maths can be affected by dyslexia and maths anxiety as well. Dyslexics' short-term memory can make it hard for them to retain maths information like basic facts. Dyslexics' difficulty with ordering and sequencing information can make it hard for them to know how to complete the steps in a maths calculation, or completing maths word problems when they have to read what the problems are. With maths anxiety, this usually shows in a test situation. They can manage maths at home when they feel relaxed, but in an environment where there's time pressure, they will become anxious. A person with dyscalculia struggles with number sense. So for example, picture 4 apples in your hand, and you know that those 4 apples are represented by the number 4. However, for someone who has dyscalculia, they don't understand the connection between numbers and quantity, and they have to go right back to this level and learn that connection. Dyscalculia is estimated to affect 5 to 6% of the population. Not as much is known about it as dyslexia, because there just hasn't been the same amount of research done. Dysgraphia is when there is a difficulty with handwriting. It's the ability to hold the pen and to sequence the pen on paper to form letters, then those letters forming words, and then putting all the words together into sentences so the writing all flows and makes sense. With dyspraxia, there are 2 parts. One is verbal dyspraxia and one is global dyspraxia. Verbal dyspraxia is when the person has trouble sequencing their mouth and tongue to form the words and the sounds to speak clearly. This is usually picked up quite young as it's noticeable. Global dyspraxia affects the ability to sequence motor movement. They can struggle with their gross motor skills and or their fine motor skills. An example for gross motor skills is like catching or throwing a ball, riding a bike, and it can impact on them playing sport. Fine motor skills can include holding a pen, writing, or using scissors. Dyspraxia also affects a person's ability to organise. They may have difficulty organising their homework. That's having to get the books ready, knowing what the homework is. It can also affect their ability to plan and organise to get from one place to another. For example, at school, getting from one classroom to another classroom, especially when it's a new school. It can also affect their socialising because of their difficulty keeping up with the flow of conversation, since it takes them time to process that verbal information. Statistics show that approximately 6% of the population has dyspraxia. Any of these specific learning differences can co-occur. So a person can have dyslexia and dyscalculia, and the co-occurrence of that is nearly 50%. They can have dyspraxia and dyslexia. They can have dyslexia and dysgraphia. So when these situations happen, when there's more than just one learning difference going on, it makes it a wee bit more complicated trying to work out what support is needed for your child. Other types of neurodiversities can also exist with these specific learning difficulties. For example, dyslexia and ADHD, or dyspraxia and autism. When we're working with children with specific learning differences, to help work out what's happening for them, we need to take into account some processing disorders. These are auditory processing disorder and types of visual stress or visual processing issues, to see if they're having an impact on their learning as well. Auditory processing disorder is when the brain struggles to process what it's hearing. The person can have perfect hearing, but it's their brain that is struggling to process the information. Examples of how it can impact is that if you're talking to your child and they're focusing on what you're saying, but there might be a bit of noise over to the side, whether it's the hum of a heat pump or it might be a couple of other children talking, that is enough to distract their attention so that they can't focus easily on what you're saying. It can be that they struggle to retain the verbal instructions you've given them, so they may only remember one instead of two or three. It can also mean that when you're talking with them and you give them information and you're explaining something, and you move on to the next part of information that you want to explain, that they're still there on that first part, trying to process and understand what you've said. They're needing more time to work through the verbal information so that they don't retain everything that you've said because they haven't been able to keep up. Auditory processing disorder can stand on its own. What that means is that a child can have auditory processing disorder without having any specific learning difference. They estimate that 2 to 3% of the population has auditory processing disorder. In our work with dyslexic children and dyslexic adults, we assume that they will have a difficulty with processing auditory information. So we will make sure that that's accommodated for accordingly. The other processing issue we consider is visual processing ones. Visual stress can impact on a person's ability to engage with reading material. A visual processing issue is not part of dyslexia. Dyslexia is a language processing issue. If there is visual stress happening, you have to manage this, and then you have to accommodate and manage for the dyslexia separately. What's important here is if there is visual stress happening for a child, it can impact on their ability to engage with the written word. So if there are supports in place to manage the dyslexia, they may not be as effective because they've got this visual stress barrier happening. Examples of visual stress can include poor vision. It can include that their two eyes focus at different points. It can be that they have poor eye tracking. Another type of visual stress is called Irlen syndrome. There are divided opinions on this type of visual stress. One side says there is no evidence, and then others say that accommodating for Irlen syndrome has increased their child's ability to learn to read because they can engage with the written word easier. With Irlen syndrome, this is when a person can have perfect vision, but it's how their brain is processing the visual information that they're taking in. It's particularly noticeable when they're looking at black writing on white paper. The glare of the white overwhelms the black writing, so it makes it harder to see, and it can feel like the writing is moving on the page. Even being in rooms that are all white can affect their ability to concentrate. Accommodations for Irlen syndrome work by reducing this glare, and they use coloured backgrounds. So if you're reading on paper, you'd be using coloured paper, or if it's on computer, you put a coloured background onto the computer screen. It is estimated that the co-occurrence of visual stress with dyslexia is nearly 50%. So this is a brief overview of the different types of specific learning differences and the associated processing issues that can come up for a child who has a difference with their learning.